We're talking about ISO today, and ooh, it's a good one. We're gonna talk about what native ISO is, why you need to know, and how this will help you choose the right ISO for your camera so you can get the cleanest images possible. So let's roll the intro and get into it. Before we start, if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss out on simple to understand photography and video tutorials, insights, and reviews. My goal is to make you sharper behind the lens, so hit that subscribe button, you won't be sorry. Anyway, ISO, you may be using it mostly correctly, but what exactly is native ISO? Are you shooting in your camera's native ISO? And how do you choose the right ISO to get the cleanest images possible? Well, we're getting into that and more, talk about some Sony cameras specifically, look at some test images, and by the end of this video, you're gonna be an ISO Jedi, super confident in choosing what ISO you should in any situation. Look, I'm a self-taught photographer myself, and I know how hard it is to understand some of the tutorials and videos out there. So stick with me for simple and straightforward explanations. So what is ISO anyway, and what does it really stand for? Well, according to Wikipedia, the acronym comes from the international standard setting body known as the International Organization for Standardization. Right. Okay, so let's start with what matters. See, it all started with film cameras. Now, bear with me because I think this will help you understand how digital cameras work and what's important. Film cameras expose the film emulsion, or the actual film strip, to different levels of light, which is denoted by the numbers on the film roll. See, this film emulsion has a coating of silver halide crystals that make it sensitive to light. The more coarse the crystals, the higher the sensitivity, and the lower the quality of the image. The finer the crystals, the lower the sensitivity, and the higher the quality of the image. The number on the canister is denoting the film's sensitivity to that light and the size of halide crystals on this film. From the lowest sensitivity of usually 100 up to the highest sensitivity in one-stop increments. So 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, and so on. So instead of halide crystals, ISO in a digital camera measures the amount of digital amplification applied to the digital camera's sensor to adjust the sensor's gain. Camera manufacturers determine the maximal usable range of ISO, which gives us the native range. So think of it like this. Camera sensors are comprised of pixels. So a 24 megapixel camera would have a sensor that contains 24 million pixels in it. And a 42 megapixel camera would have 42 million pixels in it. Each of those pixels on the sensor receives light and measures the amount of photons hitting it. This reading is then amplified to give us the equivalent ISO for that setting. In other words, every image is captured at your camera's base ISO, which is typically 100, and then amplified to give us the equivalent ISO for those settings. So if your camera is set to 400 ISO, your sensor will capture the image at 100 ISO, then amplify it to 200, and amplify it again to 400. So that's 2 full stops of amplification to give you the equivalent 400 ISO, effectively tripling the brightness through amplification. The result is usually a grainier and less detailed image, especially at ISOs of 3200, 6400, and above. So then the question is, what's extended ISO? Well, let's first talk about what extended ISO is not. First of all, extended ISO does not make your sensor more sensitive to light. What it does do is it extends the native ISO range by pushing your image to the maximum limit of that native ISO range, and then pushing the image additional stops of light using software processing. In other words, extended ISO is basically your furthest range of native with a multiplier of software processing. And the effectiveness of both the native range and the extended range is what makes some cameras better than others in low light situations. So let's take a look at some sample images, and then let's talk about how to figure out what the native ISO range is for your camera. But first, tell me, what's the highest ISO you're comfortable shooting with and still retaining enough image detail and quality for your work? I personally use ISO 100 whenever I can control the light, and if I can't, I try to stay under 1600 for typical situations or 8000 for astrophotography. But what about you? Leave in the comments below and let me know. Okay, so let's take a look at some images and compare the results of the ISO amplification to the quality of the images. What I did was I locked the camera off on a tripod and kept the aperture constant, just changing the shutter speed and ISO values so we could see the impact of changing the method of capturing the light. Okay, starting with the lowest possible ISO setting in the native range, ISO 100, you can see here that the image is sharp and smooth with absolutely zero noticeable grain as we zoom into 100%. Stepping up to 400, 800, and even 1600 ISO, the image is still quite smooth and sharp and noise-free, no surprise. As we hit 3200 ISO though, we can just start to see some grain appear here in the red cape and background details. When we hit 6400, the grain is definitely noticeable, though still quite usable and clean enough for most commercial purposes. When we hit 12800 though, things begin to break down a bit in the high contrast areas like the edge of that red helmet and the reds of the cape and the lightsabers in particular. By 25600, the image contains much more grain across the board, but can probably still be processed in post to produce a clean enough image for commercial purposes. Then at ISO 32000, the highest native range level for the A7R III here, we're at the absolute limit of usability in my opinion. And when we then step to the extended range of 51,200 and then 102,400, the image is just too noisy and grainy and the color rendition breaks down too much for usability with fringing and ghosting and heavy grain throughout. This is where the software processing of the camera is just unable to produce the true equivalent ISO image, and the camera makers know this, labeling this level to be outside of the camera's native or usable range. Okay, so now how can you tell what your camera's native ISO range is? Well, there are two ways. First, you can just go to the manufacturer's website and look at the specifications of your camera. Taking the Sony a7 III, for instance, a camera that has 24.2 megapixels, that camera has a native ISO of 100 to 51,200 and an expanded ISO of 50 to 204,800. That means the camera will capture an image at the top end of its native range of 51,200, then use software to push it to additional stops from 51,200 to 102,400 to 204,800 in order to get that extended range to 204,800. Also, it's worth noting here that at the low end, if your native range is 100 on the low end and your extended range goes down to 50, remember that the camera sensor is capturing whatever image you're taking at 100. So if your highlights are blown out at 100, even if you push that ISO down to 50, your camera is just using its sensor's software to approximate what that image would look like with half the light, though it doesn't have information in those blown out highlights at 100. Which is why I always stay at 100 and make sure my highlights are not blown out. Then I know I'm capturing all the information, and it's why I never recommend going down to the extended range below 100. Now, a second way to tell what your camera's range is on the camera itself. So when you go to choose ISO, you'll see that there will be little lines above and below the numbers when you go into the extended range. So if you see those lines pop up above and below the ISO you're choosing, you know that you're outside of your camera's native range. Okay, so to review, number one, always shoot in RAW, and that will give your image processing software the most information possible to push and pull images in post-processing. A better place to do it than in your camera. Number two, know your camera's native range and stay in it. Leave the ISO approximation to the camera's sensor, not the software of the camera. Number three, always use the lowest native ISO you can within reason for the image you're trying to create. And then finally, once you have that raw image loaded into your computer, use professional software like Capture One or Lightroom or Photoshop to push and pull the image to the maximum amount and keep that quality to the maximum level. Okay, I hope that helps make you sharper behind the lens and ready to take cleaner images faster. If you think it did, please hit that like button below as it really does help. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.